"Twilight, there's someone at the door to see you," Spike called, shaking her shoulder. Twilight looked up from her writing, blinking back tears. It was now late afternoon, the sun still shining brightly through the windows, the day outside looking just as perfect as it had when she came inside. Spike just looked at her sadly and handed over her staff. "You might need this," he reminded her. She shook her head, pushing away the pain of her memories, and nodded. "Thanks, Spike. Who is it?" "It's Apple Bloom," he replied. "She's got some kids with her." Twilight grimaced, frustrated. "Probably coming by to mock me or something," she grumbled. Spike shook his head. "No, I think you'll like this visit," he replied. Helping her up, she moved aside as she limped over to the front door, wiping the tears from her eye. Somewhat apprehensively, she opened the front door, looking out into the sunlight. "Yes?" she called. Apple Bloom stood there, a vibrant teenager with bright red hair and piercing magenta eyes. She was dressed much like her brother usually did, in overalls and a work shirt. Behind her were a small group of kids, the same ones that had run away from Twilight earlier in the day. Twilight scowled at them, and they hid behind Apple Bloom, fear on their faces. Apple Bloom looked between Twilight's and the kids in mock disappointment, then smiled at her. "Hey, Twilight, how's things?" "That depends," Twilight replied curtly. "Are you to make fun of me? Scream and run away from the monster lady?" "Hey, Twilight, there's no need for that," Apple Bloom chided. "I'm just here to remind these silly billies," she glared behind her at the kids, "that there's nothing to fear from you. I remember well when you came here and how nice you were to me and everyone." Twilight stared at Apple Bloom. "You don't hate me? You don't think I'm frightening?" Apple Bloom looked at her with a measure of pity. "Twilight, I was there," she repeated simply. "I saw you after you lost your eye. You were so scared and hurt. How could I be afraid of you after that? Even with all the stuff y'all went through, you were still so nice to us." I hesitated, then replied, But Applejack, "Ma sis did what she had to do," Apple Bloom replied. "I know how much you tried to help her, and I love you for it." She motioned for Twilight to come outside. "Now come on, show these littles that you're okay." Twilight carefully limped out of her cottage and into the sunlight. The warmth on her face was a wonderful feeling, and the calm air was refreshing after cooping herself up in the cottage for so long. The kids behind Apple Bloom huddled together as she limped closer, and she paused. Seeing the encouragement on Apple Bloom's face, Twilight approached closer as Apple Bloom pushed the kids forward. Moving slowly, her legs stiff and weak, Twilight carefully lowered herself down so she was level with many of them and sat quietly waiting for them to make the first move. Soon enough, a little girl with silver and white hair approached her hesitantly, but when Twilight remained still, screwed up her courage, and came to stand next to her, inspecting her with awe. Twilight simply looked back at the girl, unsure of what to say, or if even to speak. Apple Bloom looked on encouragingly. "Go on, Silverbell," she said to the little girl. "It's okay, she won't bite." Silverbell reached out and touched the smooth side of my face. Awed. Are you really Twilight Sparkle?" she asked in a soft voice. Twilight nodded. "Yes, I am. I'm sorry if I frighten you. I know what I look like." Silverbell smiled. "Guys, it's really her, it is." With that, the children were suddenly surrounding her, touching her arms, shoulders and face, and peppering her with questions and comments. "Wow, your hair is beautiful. I wish mine looked like that." "Did you really beat all those bad guys? Why can't you walk right? You saved my daddy's life, thanks." Apple Bloom was there, restoring order with practiced precision. Now, kiddos, give us some space and a chance to answer. Now, one at a time, okay?" Twilight smiled at the children, and they stared back at her, awed. A little boy with emerald green hair raised his hand. "Miss Twilight, does that hurt?" He pointed to her eye. She shook her head. No, it doesn't hurt. Not anymore. It did when it happened, but the pain has faded. Another girl with pale pink hair raised her hand. Miss Twilight, did you really beat all those bad guys like everyone says you did? Twilight smiled. Yes, I did, but not by myself. I had help from some of the greatest friends I could ever hope to know. One of them was Applebloom's sister. The children turned back to Applebloom, astonishment on their faces. She nodded, blushing at the sudden attention. Cool, exclaimed one of the children. Miss Twilight? And so the afternoon passed into the evening. Twilight and Applebloom talking with the children. It was nearly dark before Applebloom finally announced to the children that it was time to get home, and that she would get in trouble if she kept them out too much later. There was a collective groan from the children, but they all came up and hugged Twilight, thanking her for talking with them. Twilight hugged them all back and carefully pushed herself back to her feet, leaning on her staff. As the children huddled together, talking excitedly about all they had heard today, Applebloom came up and gave Twilight a big hug. Thanks, Twilight, she said gratefully. No, Applebloom, thank you, Twilight replied. This has been wonderful. Believe me, I've needed something like this to remind me who I really am. As Applebloom left, herding the children back to their homes, Twilight watched them all go with a sad smile on her face, leaning on her staff. Oh, Applejack, if you only could see her right now. What a wonderful young woman your sister has turned out to be. With that, Twilight went back into her cottage. Spike was waiting for her, a small smile on his face. What? She asked him. Nothing, he replied. It's just that this is the happiest I've seen you in weeks. She smiled sheepishly. Yeah, well, it's the best I've felt in weeks. I truly needed that. Spike motioned over to her favorite chair by the fire and said, Come on, Twilight, let's relax for a while. I'll make you some dinner. She nodded, and with his assistance she got herself settled into the chair, while he proceeded to cook up some dinner for the two of them. As she basked in the warmth of the fire, thinking back on her day, Spike sat down with her, and the two of them talked well into the night. After the fire had burned out, and the dark sky outside was filled with twinkling stars, they decided to call it a night. Twilight limped over to her bed, got herself ready and settled in, a feeling of peace filling her. She felt that she was more than ready to continue her story, as the questions from the children had made it even more important to her to finish and had given her the strength to continue writing. With that thought, she fell asleep, dreaming of joyful times with her old friends.